Before the March on Washington, African Americans lived in segregation. Public areas were split into two sections, one for whites and one for blacks. Many African Americans were not hired due to their race. They were discriminated against within the school systems and within everyday life. Blacks could not use the same bathrooms, drink out of the same water fountains, or even walk on the same side of the street as white citizens. The housings that African Americans lived in were unsanitary and crowded. They were usually located in the ghettos or slums. During this time period, there were laws and acts set in place that allowed these acts of discrimination to be legal. One set of these laws were called the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were established during the 1800s. Because of these laws, it was legal to discriminate based on the color of one's skin. In years previous, Congress had passed the Plessy v. Ferguson Act. This act stated that it was legal to have segregated facilities, but they must be equal. However, people got around this law easily. As well as these laws and acts, there were groups that promoted this discrimination. They preached to others that African Americans were not as worthy of basic civil rights as those with white skin. One of these groups was the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK for short. The KKK were an extremely strong group that were known for lynching over 4,000 people who were of color. They also lynched people who openly supported the belief of equality for all races. Life before the March on Washington was miserable for non-whites in America due to the unfair treatment that was bestowed upon them. Discrimination was common, and though it was more dominant in the South, it was still seen in the North. Many African Americans spoke out against this unfair treatment, but their words could only go so far. They formed groups that fought for African American civil rights by means of nonviolent protests. In 1941, leaders of these groups made the decision to come together into one large movement, the March on Washington. The March on Washington was a huge movement that showed how far people had come in fighting discrimination. After this march, the Jim Crow laws were abolished, and there were no longer segregated streets, water fountains, or schools. The March on Washington spurred national awareness for civil rights movement by uniting a nation with a common goal. Despite the organization's differences as to go about achieving equality, they came together in this one movement and inspired many individuals to work together in order to end segregation and achieve equality. The March on Washington occurred on August 28, 1941 at the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. This movement was a gathering of over 250,000 people who supported equality and the fight for African American civil rights. This was the largest demonstration that had ever occurred at the nation's capital and the first demonstration to have excessive television coverage. This television coverage resulted in millions of people being able to view the march even if they were not physically present. Though African Americans were the dominant race that were present that day, over a quarter of the people who attended were white. The march was set up by a group of leaders who represented several civil rights organizations. These leaders and groups included James Farmer, who represented the Congress of Racial Equality, and Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as well as numerous others. The most famous speech at this march was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. As well as speeches, there were also various musical performances by Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Mahalia Jackson, all of which advocated openly in favor of equality. This march took place in front of the Lincoln Memorial. King specifically chose this location because he believed that he and Lincoln shared a common goal, to unite all races so that there would be no more discrimination. Lincoln had showed that he supported this cause when in 1863 he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation stated that all those who were enslaved in the Confederate territory, which composed mainly of the southern states, were to be freed. In the beginning of King's speech he says, 60 years ago. This is an allusion to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, when Lincoln said 7 years ago. King valued Lincoln's words. Though this protest was nonviolent, the president ordered heavy police forces in case the huge crowd got out of hand. However, this was unnecessary. No one at the march got out of control or violent. The objective of this march was to eliminate racial segregation and pass laws that forbade discriminating against someone for the color of their skin. This march was also supposed to raise awareness of the struggles of African Americans in their fight against racism. The March on Washington was a great success in creating awareness for the fight for civil rights. This event gave a glimpse of how the world should look like with white and African American people working together rather than against each other. Tension having to do with African American rights and equality had been rising for decades, and the March on Washington was a turning point that gave hope for many that a new beginning was in the future. Even though many of the speakers and organizations had different ideas about how to obtain rights for African Americans, the actual event showed how different leaders put aside their differences and united in this one movement. The leaders that spoke talked about the future they saw for America. Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, that all men are created equal." King saw a future of equality. His powerful words inspired many to continue believing in this dream rather than give up. Also, the diversity within the participants emphasized the idea of equality was supported by more than just African Americans. After the march, Martin Luther King Jr. and a few other civil rights leaders who took part in the March on Washington met with President Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. King and the other leaders told Kennedy and Johnson that it was essential that they have support for their cause within the government. The government's support would give hope to people who supported their cause that all their work towards equality was not for nothing. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were the two acts that were a direct result of the March on Washington. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made discrimination on the basis of race as well as sex illegal. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected the people's right to vote. Though these two acts were passed after Kennedy's shooting, before his death he had worked hard to try to get these acts passed. After his death, President Lyndon made sure that the two acts were passed. After the march, a poll was done that showed that 75% of white Americans supported ending segregation in public facilities, schools, and as well as equal job opportunities. Exactly 12 days after the March on Washington, on September 9, 1963, on the first day of school in Birmingham, Alabama, 3 public schools were integrated by court order. This change in segregation within public schooling was a huge step towards equality. Previously, there was segregated schooling, and white schools were generally in better condition and given better school supplies than black schools. This segregated schooling ensured that African American children would not be at a disadvantage when it came to schooling and when it came to their education. Also, the fact that the court ordered integrating schooling was a huge step in itself. Before this significant event in history, there were many different movements that advocated for African American rights. This movement provided proof that even though the various organizations had very different ideas, they were still capable of coming together. The changes that America saw in the years and even weeks after the march is proof that through being persistent in their ideas and hard work, these people could end segregation and make a difference.